Hello and welcome back to another KCC video. I'm Rob and today we'll be jumping into malicious compliance. Before we start, please hit that subscribe button and click the notification bell so you know when the next video goes live. Our first story today comes to us from World Machine. I hate standardized tests. Let's jump right in. There's a teacher in the high school I attend, Mrs. B, who taught English 9 so long my mother was in her class. I've only heard good things about her, and none of them are unfounded. She's done a lot for the community. She loves working with students, she teaches with a passion, and she hates traditional tests. She's always been against the idea, but that never stopped the state from making a system that forces the teacher to teach a bullet list of items, and the students get tested on what they should know by the end of the year. In English's case, with an essay on one topic scored on citation, accuracy, and grammar. Fast forward to 2 years ago, when the state realized the test didn't help scores any, big shock, and said our local counties will try to replace the system with something new, which mine did, with a system that forces everyone to write an essay on one of 3 topics that gets scored for citation, accuracy, and grammar. Mrs. B rolled her eyes, explaining this to my fellow students. When we voiced our concerns, Mrs. B made it clear she didn't like it either and ended her rant with, "I'll figure something out." The first day of the couple weeks we get to write the essay, she, as required by the rules, had to read us the directions and prompt. She went through everything like she was supposed to, but then she went back and called to attention one part of it, a sentence reading. Once you open the Google Doc, the teacher cannot help you at all. She made very clear that we couldn't come to her for anything after we opened the doc. Then, after doing so, she walks to the front of the classroom and states, "So, if you don't open the doc and use the prompt I already showed you to write an essay on paper, I can and will help you with any questions you have." 5 silent seconds pass before she looks to the class and says, with a smile, "I hate standardized tests." I didn't know this at the time, but she was only one of a group of teachers across the country who formulated, coordinated, and executed the exact same plan. Needless to say, every student under these teachers, including me, got our essays on paper to be revised before we opened the doc and submitted them, netting all of us high scores. The higher-ups caught wind of what happened, and they were angry, but no one in that teacher group ever got punished because they never broke a rule. The directions were worded much more carefully the next year, and the teacher group responded by finding and using another loophole instead. Talk of making a new system started again after that. Now, wouldn't there be a problem with a test from that class because they'd probably have a higher average than normal? I mean, it's gotta be pretty obvious in the results when a teacher lets you cheat on a test. Teacher took a really big chance here. I've seen stories of other teachers in the States getting arrested and actually doing jail time for circumventing the standardized testing. Our next story comes to us from Evening Sand, case of the missing floor buffer. Let's jump right in. About 20 years ago, I was enlisted in the Marines. One of the things Marines are famous for is janitorial service. We swept, we mopped, and we buffed the floor like nobody's business. It wasn't wartime. This is Garrison Marine Corps. Since the day I checked in, my platoon was assigned 2 floor buffers. My specific shop within the platoon was accountable for producing those floor buffers during inspection. Thing is, the shop had only ever had 1 floor buffer, and my shop took the hit for not being able to produce a piece of government property during an inspection. More specifically, I took the hit. A year or 2 went by, and perhaps 2 or 3 of these inspections had occurred, all resulting in our inability to produce the second floor buffer, and all giving my shop a black mark on our inspection readiness record. Because if you're gonna go to war, you're gonna need 2 floor buffers. By this time, I get used to how DRMO works, Defense Reutilization and Marketing Office. Basically, it's where units like mine can dispose of government property and get it off of our books, like broken chairs, refrigerators, or even vehicles. Where applicable, each item that was turned in had its serial number recorded, and a receipt for said item and serial number was issued in return. Units could also pick through what was turned in, however, they would be required to add these things to their books cost-free. Civilians or individuals were allowed to buy items, but had to do so out of pocket. Another kick you in the nuts inspection was coming up, so the plan was hatched. A DRMO run was made where a floor buffer handle was procured as an individual. I believe $2 was handed over to pay for this item. The floor buffer handle, it should be noted, does not contain the serial number of the floor buffer. The big bottom round thing did. The handle was brought back to my shop, engraved with the missing floor buffer serial number, and promptly returned to DRMO. A receipt containing the return of a floor buffer with a serial number that matched the missing floor buffer was issued, and that receipt was taken to our supply officer to remove the specific floor buffer from our inventory. Through malicious compliance, the case of the missing floor buffer was solved. Anyone else think they should have had some fun with it and forged some paperwork saying that the actual inspector checked out the floor buffer 3 years ago and never returned it? It does make me wonder right back to the beginning though how they only ended up with one floor buffer. Who signed off on the paperwork saying they had two when they only laid eyes on one? I don't get it. Our next story comes to us from Jeb Ploxy. Round my hours? Okay, thanks. Let's jump right in. So I read another post about someone's job rounding their hours, and I figured that I would post mine. I work at a place where many people are salary, but there are also people on a time clock. Most of the time, clock employees have a factory worker kind of position, so that makes a lot of sense. Then there are mainly office workers, like me, who are on a punch clock due to our positions. Office workers on the time clock generally have their time checked by supervisors who don't really care about some overtime. Anyway, we used to have a pay service which also provided a time clock that would log the minute you used the machine. It would calculate your time based on the minute you punched in or out. I thought this was a pretty good idea. It made sense to me. Then, as the title implies, this was no longer the case. Our company switched to a different payroll service and had a different time clock. The new service began to round my time to the nearest quarter hour. It took me a couple paychecks to finally figure out what was happening. I saw that it clearly rounded to the nearest quarter hour, but I assumed at first that it was counting every minute and rounding. No, it was rounding up or down from the minute you used the clock. I was annoyed by this at first. I was especially annoyed that there was another rule where the clock would always round up to the next quarter hour during the first clock in of the day. I saw no reason for the clock to round. It is a computer and the math is easy. Eventually, realized that the new rules were made for the dozens of production workers. They have to begin working at and start being paid for a certain time, so they have to clock in a little early. They also take their lunches all around the same time. The new time clock rules make a lot of sense for them. I work in the office, and I don't have a strict schedule. If I wanted to blow through lunch and leave early, I'm allowed. I can take lunch at 11 or 2 or whenever, nobody cares. I have work to do, and I do it. I know that I'm very lucky to be in this situation, but my relationship with HR regarding this time clock started on the wrong foot. Cue malicious compliance. Knowing that it makes no difference to my pay if I clock in at 8:01 or 8:15, if I'm running a little late in the morning, I'll just calm down and take an extra minute. For lunch, I'll usually now clock out at something like 12:08 and then clock back in at like 12:51. That's 43 minutes to eat, but it only counts as 30 minutes as far as the time clock cares. Then when I leave, if I'm leaving at 5 for example, I'll clock out at like 5:08, which counts as 5:15. I gently expressed a dissatisfaction with the rounding clock when I first learned about it, so I don't really feel on the hook for this. They can come and tell me outright if they want me to change these practices. I usually squeeze some overtime out every week because of this system. At one of my jobs in the past, we used ADP to punch in and punch out at the end of the day. But the only thing was, the boss would actually go in and change our times. That meant if one day I happened to be a little bit early and punched in 5 minutes early, I'd check ADP later in the day, and it would say that I punched in on the dot. This is, however, the same boss that had a god complex and allowed a sign in the back room that was making fun of one of our customers with a lisp. Rotten hell, Rick. Our next story comes to us from Sean Coates. Did it now. Let's jump right in. Many years ago, I worked at a company in Canada that ran some financial services. The owner was the kind of guy who drove race cars on weekends and on weekdays would come into the programmer's room to complain that our fingers weren't typing fast enough. On a particularly panicky day, one of the web servers in the pool that served our app became unresponsive. We had these servers hosted in a managed rack at a hosting provider off-site. After several hours of trying to bring it back, our hosting partner admitted defeat and declared that they couldn't revive Web02. It had a hardware failure of some sort. We only had a few servers back then, and they were named according to their roles in our infrastructure: Web01, Web02, Cron01, DB03, etc. Traffic and backlog started piling up with Web02 out of the cluster, despite our efforts to mitigate the loss, which we considered temporary. Our head of IT was on the phone with our hosting provider, trying to come up with a plan to replace the server. This was before cloud was a thing, and each of our resources was a physically present piece of hardware. The agreed upon solution was replace Web02 with a new box, which they were rushing into place from their reserve of hardware on site. By this point, the race car driving, finger typing, speed complaining owner of the company was absolutely losing it. It seemed like he was screaming at anyone and everyone who dared make eye contact, even if they had truly nothing to do with the server failure or its replacement. Our teams worked together to get the new box up and running in record time, and were well into configuring the operating system and necessary software when they realized that no one wanted to go out on a limb and give the new machine a name. President Screamy was very particular about these names for some reason, and this had been the target of previous rage fests. So neither the hosting lead nor our internal soldiers wanted to make a decision that they knew could be deemed wrong and end up the target of even more yelling. So they agreed that the hosting provider would call the CEO and ask him what he'd like to name the box. But before that call could be made, the CEO called our hosting provider to tear them up. He was assured that the box was almost ready, and that the only remaining thing was whether to name it Web02 to replace the previous box or to give it a whole new name like Web06. Rageman did not like this at all, and despite being at the other end of the office floor from his office, we could all hear him lay fully into the otherwise innocent phone receiver on the other end. "I just need that box up now. Fix it. I don't care what you call it. It just needs to be live. Do it now." And that, friends, is how we ended up with a web pool of servers named Web01, Web03, Web04, Web05, and the new server, Do It Now. It also served well as a cautionary tale for new hires who happened to notice. Okay, honestly, that boss was just looking for a problem. The tech from the hosting company even gave him options to use the old name or come up with a new one. I feel sorry for anyone who has to work under that guy. Our last story today comes to us from Beck Andrews. Want me to read the most extensive role of the play in class? Sure thing. Let's jump right in. I was recently reminded of one of my greatest acts of malicious compliance, a 2-for-1 from my high school days. For some context, I absolutely hated reading out loud in class growing up. I had no issues with reading or reading comprehension. In fact, I was one of those kids who was reading on a college level in middle school, 6th to 8th year, but I had issues when reading out loud. Still do, in fact. I didn't know it at the time, but I grew up with ADHD. One of the things about my ADHD is my brain has a tendency to work faster than my mouth, so I end up tripping over words when I read out loud. That, on top of general social anxiety, made reading out loud hell for me. Most teachers had a tendency to leave me be, since I was a good student. But not my 10th grade literature teacher, oh no. For some reason, she had a bug in her bonnet when it came to me. She wasn't a bad teacher, but she had a habit of trying to make me come out of my shell, and I hated it. I've mostly outgrown my social anxiety these days, but back then, it was pretty bad. On to the malicious compliance. At some point in the year, we studied the Shakespeare play Julius Caesar. As a part of that unit, she would take volunteers to read for the different parts. If you didn't volunteer, she would assign you a part. The first part of my malicious compliance was simple. If I had to volunteer to read a part, I would find the smallest part possible to read. Hello, plebeian number 1. I played by her rules and it worked for a bit. However, she was still intent on yanking me out of my perfectly comfy introverted shell. One day, she decided she'd had enough of my loophole. As I sat there, having scouted out the smallest part possible and ready to volunteer when got down the list of characters to it, she threw me for an absolute loop by assigning me the part of Brutus right off the bat. Crap, that guy talks a lot. Probably the biggest part in that play. My stomach turned at the thought of stumbling through his lines, but a light bulb went off in my head. You see, this teacher also had a huge thing for us reading the parts with appropriate emotion. This was my new loophole. We started reading, and I read for Brutus in a way that would make any drama teacher cry. Monotone, lifeless, no emotion. If I had to suffer through reading it, you have to suffer through listening to it. We got maybe a fourth of the way through the scene before she gave in and had one of the more extroverted kids read the part instead. I went back to life as plebeian number 1, and all was right in the world again. Oh my gosh, I used to love reading in front of the class when I was a kid because I was the one who would kinda go off and improv. Teacher's not looking? Hey look, Brutus just jumped onto his moped and he's gone down to the local Domino's for a pizza. Thank you to all 5 OPs for posting in the Malicious Compliance subreddit. They are linked down below. Please go check them out. Check out one of these other videos, and if you haven't yet, please consider subscribing for more daily Reddit stories.